Well, I can tell you guys why I want to make this space. So I should say this is my first space ever. I haven't done one before. I've listened to many, but I haven't hosted one. And it was also a spontaneous decision. I was inspired sort of by, some of you might have seen it, the video by Last Week Tonight on the subject of prostitution. You know, the show hosted by the comedian John Oliver. It discussed the sex trade, and it did cover a lot of very important points. It talked extensively about police violence, which is a real concern, especially in a country like the US with prohibition, where women and other people in the sex trade are punished for, yeah, just trying to survive. Which I'm glad that at least on the left, we're coming to a consensus that obviously arresting people, putting them in jail, or fining them for trying to survive is just wrong. But it misses this whole other side to prostitution. There is an antagonistic relationship between the women in the sex trade and law enforcement, there's no question. But there are also two other groups that are pretty important and that are sadly sources of abuse and violence, and that's obviously pimps and johns. And I found it a pretty stark omission that in that video, I don't remember pimps being mentioned at all. So the assumption is that there isn't a lot of organized crime involved in the sex trade, which my understanding is unfortunately that's not true. Yeah, it doesn't ask the really important question of, is it okay to buy sex? Okay, we agree now it's okay to sell. That doesn't hurt other people, but is it okay to buy sex? Or can I even buy sex? Or what is it exactly that I'm buying? Some people call it a service. Other people call it, yeah, many people call it work. What does that mean exactly? So I can understand, especially from an American perspective, like the video covers extensive police violence, but we also have information from countries like mine. So for those of you that don't know, I'm from Germany, and most of what I study in relation to the sex trade is in relation to Germany. What we're finding with reduced police, that doesn't fix the violence problem in the sex trade. That doesn't fix everything from disrespect to robbery to rape to murder. Those are still being committed by sex buyers and pimps because, well, there's a variety of factors, but just moving the police out is unfortunately a gift to organized crime. And the idea that all a woman needs is for her, her sex selling to be decriminalized, then she can go to the police. It's not that simple. There are a lot of other barriers. But I do today not want to have this detailed law discussion. We'll save that for another time, and I should be better prepared with notes and everything for that. Today, I want to discuss the case of why, like the title says, sex buying is not a victimless crime. Yeah, many people like to say we can abolish vice squads, we can get rid of that. It's just, a guy who's a little bit lonely and a woman who needs a little bit of cash. What's the big deal? That's what I want to discuss today. And I do have some notes that I want to go through. I wrote a blog post on a specific subject, I think 1 or 2 years ago, called Consent Culture and Sex Buying Cannot Coexist, because one of the things I want to talk about are these liberal and progressive values that we all say we have. And especially, in the era of Me Too, we keep talking about consent and, what is violence, what is a gray area, and what is consensual sex. But we don't need to be applying any of that logic to the sex trade. We're, I would say, like demolishing those rules. We're creating two tiers or two sectors in our private lives, in our dating lives. There are certain rules. We're holding especially men to certain standards. But in the sex trade, those standards go out the window. Yeah, so I'll be more concrete about what I mean by that. Might just introduce myself just a little bit more for those that might not know me. So I'm Ellie Euro. I'm a feminist activist from Germany, and my main subject is violence against women and girls. And as many of you know, Germany has a very liberal prostitution policy. We have legal brothels, escort services, street prostitution areas, and we also have a very strong culture of, men going to brothels on the 18th birthday or during a business conference or, yeah, in a variety of settings, alone and in groups. And for about the last 7 years, I've been extensively reading on the subject, talked to various stakeholders. So that's women who have experienced prostitution personally, as social workers and, doctors and law scholars, and yeah, just a variety of groups. And I've also talked to women who say that to them, prostitution is work, and it's empowering. And I find that their testimony too, like I don't divide into only listen to those women, don't listen to those women. I think you can from all women, and the ones that say prostitution is violence, the ones that are ambivalent, and the ones that say that it's work or even empowerment. You can learn something from all of them. But me personally, cumulatively, taking the testimony of a lot of people together, I don't think. I think prostitution is neither sex nor work, and it's also why I put sex buying in quotation marks. There isn't really great language to discuss Johns. It starts with the fact that we don't have a good word for this group of men. It's mostly men. I know there are some women in there, but for example, in Germany, we don't have any brothels that cater exclusively to women. There are actually a lot of legal brothels that women aren't even allowed to enter, right? But like I said, we don't even have good language. We say John or punter or client or sex buyer. I don't like any of these terms. I'm probably going to be using all of them interchangeably. Not a big fan of any of them. But yeah, I think it's important to talk about this group because while we're all busy discussing, like I said, just the woman in the trade herself and her level of agency or lack thereof, and the role of law enforcement, we forget really the biggest group of people in the sex trade context. There are significantly more buyers than sellers. So why don't we about these millions of men? Okay, so like I said, this is the structure of this space is broadly based on a blog post that I wrote some time ago where I summarized the reasons why sex buying is not a victimless crime. Trigger warning for that because it actually does discuss sexual violence. Some of this stuff is difficult. So if that's not what you want to listen to tonight or whatever time it is where you are, then maybe this is not the space for you. Now I'm going to get started with the actual content of this space. And I'm going to start the quote by a woman who survived prostitution. I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce her name. Her name is Mia de Fawite, and she said this about the sex trade. We could give as many lessons on sexual consent as we like, but as long as it remained legal for anyone to go online or drive down a street and buy a woman, and very often a girl, the confusion would remain. That does really go to the heart of the matter, the kind of sexual culture that at least people who see themselves as leftist or progressive, but I would posit people across the political spectrum or just decent people, the kind of sexual culture we want is one based on respect and essentially mutuality. Like when we are discussing how we want to raise boys, then we talk to them about how it is important. Like it starts small, like we teach little kids, that they can't touch someone else, or they shouldn't accept other people touching them unless they want to. And then as they become teenagers, we talk about, or we're starting to slowly talk about how it's important that both people feel comfortable, both people experience pleasure. Yeah, there are gray areas, there are delicate subjects there, but we are trying to establish a culture that at the very least, at the basis, has sex only takes place when two people want it, when two people, they don't have to be married. Sure, it can be a one night stand, but both people feel this is what they want in the moment. Both people feel good about it. And what we want to get rid of is like a husband expecting because he's married to a woman, she owes him sex. Or, we talk about incel culture. We talk about these young men who are really angry that nobody wants to date them. Nobody says to these men, yes, you're old. We're all telling them, look, you got to work on yourself, be that going to the gym, going to therapy, getting a hobby, getting a friend circle first before you go looking for a girlfriend. Like we tell these men and boys to learn about mutuality and respect and consent and to work on themselves, right? But what is the sex trade? In the sex trade, a man can call up a woman like he can a pizza. The reason that men pay for sex is, well, there are several, but at the core is it's easy, it's immediate, and he doesn't have to care about her attraction, right? So that's how you can have men who are 2, 3 times as old as the woman who's selling. And the idea is that money replaces that mutuality. She is not interested, she doesn't want to have sex, he does, but she needs money. And that's okay, that compensates. It doesn't make any sense to me that we're trying to teach young boys and men that if the girl says no, you leave her alone, you don't start offering her money. We can't teach men and boys to leave girls and women alone who are not interested and then say, yeah, but that group of women and girls over there, they're also not interested in you, but you just pay them and then it's okay. Suddenly it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that she is in essence enduring the sexual contact. at best. And if you don't want it, for me, that the average interaction in the sex trade is not mutual, is not wanted, but is being at best endured. In my blog post, I link to a study actually conducted by the New Zealand government. So the place where the prostitution policy that is currently being advocated by a lot of the, pro-prostitution or pro-sex work movement. And that too says the average woman in the sex trade does not want to be having that sex. She wants to be able to pay her rent, to pay her debts, to not become homeless, to take care of her kids, to get necessities. And that sort of brings me to the next point. We are talking about, rising prices and housing crisis and predatory landlords. It's happened to me. It's happened to an endless number of my friends that a landlord or potential landlord, we contact him and we say, like, I'm interested in this apartment. And then he says, I can give it to you for a better price, or I can even give it to you for free in exchange for, and the implication is that you're going to have to be sexually available. And all of that is predatory. We all agree that's wrong. That's exploiting, a woman's need for housing, a basic need. That's not okay. That wouldn't be consensual. But if instead the woman who needs housing earns the money to pay her rent in the brothel, that's somehow different. That doesn't make any sense to me. She still has to endure. Again, language in this area is difficult. I'm going to call it sexual contact because I know a lot of people feel rape would be too strong, but I also don't want to call it, sex, which for me implies mutuality, which is what I'm talking about, which is what's lacking. But yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me that a landlord exploiting a woman so that she can have housing, yep, that's exploitation. But if instead it happens in the brothel, it's something completely different, and now it's a job. That's still sex that she doesn't want to be having, which a lot of us would consider violence. I'm just going to go through some examples to illustrate all of this. The next example actually connects to what was discussed in this Last Week Tonight John Oliver video. For those of you who've seen it, he made this joke that he compared prostitution to working at Subway. And he said something about, I guess there must have been some kind of scandal about the meat quality at Subway, whatever. And his joke was, at least in sex work, customers know what they're eating. We can argue how tasteful that joke is. I think it's pretty gross, and it just displays his ignorance of the sex trade. So one thing that I've done, right, I've spent a lot of time on these forums where men talk to each other, where sex workers talk to each other, and one thing that you find throughout is that oral sex on the woman is not something that she initiates or desires. It's something that he pays extra for, because every time that men are doing something that is giving her additional discomfort or is gross for her or poses extra health risks, that's when they have to pay extra. And again, comparing it to the kind of sexual culture that we're talking outside, we're talking about, where's the clitoris, and how can men become better at oral sex? How can we close the orgasm gap? Like, we're talking about, we're making all these demands that, I agree with. I want women in the bedroom to be happy, but either those standards go for all women or we don't establish them, because not only is, the orgasm, her orgasm doesn't even feature in prostitution. That's not the point. It's all centered on his. He pays extra for her to play act during, when he performs oral sex on her. And it's, what stronger way to illustrate that it is not about female pleasure than, in the prostitution context, oral sex is a chore for her rather than a pleasure, which it is, in a consensual relationship of whatever kind. Okay, moving on. It's going to be a little bit all over the place thematically, but I hope you guys can follow along. What else do we talk about? We say communication during sex is so important. People need to talk about what is desired, what is not, what is too far. But in the sex trade, the way that it works is essentially, there's some negotiation up front. He says, I want X, Y, Z. And if she's able to, if she can afford to, she might be able to say no to some of those things. But a lot of women, again, to make ends meet, to pay rent, will have to say, yeah, okay, let's do that. He essentially orders off a menu, and then his expectation is, well, we'll follow through. We will do the things that we previously agreed to. Maybe some of you remember that a lot of people started joking, about the affirmative consent model. Oh, are we going to sign contracts? Like, that's not realistic. That's not how sex works. Exactly, that's not how sex works, because in real sex, you should be, in consensual sex, to rescind your consent to any part of it at any time. But what is it like when he has paid? Well, he really feels that he's owed. And another thing that makes the communication aspect difficult, I don't think a lot of people realize, but there are a lot of interactions between Johns and sex sellers where the woman and the John don't speak the same language. Like she doesn't speak English or German, depending on where she is. Like it's not a myth. We have clear statistics on this that, for example, in places like Germany, migrant women from Eastern Europe and some other places dominate. A lot of them don't speak German. These two people can't have a conversation. How can that be, well communicated sex on eye level? This context is a little bit different in places like the US because there is enough poverty in the US that the sex trade can recruit from the local population, right? And we know that especially Black and Indigenous women are vastly, vastly overrepresented. And it makes no sense that we see power imbalances everywhere, especially on the basis of race, and rightly so. But in the sex trade, suddenly it's not outrageous that it is, affluent, mostly white men purchasing women of color. That is not a huge deal. It's not some kind of human rights scandal. It makes no sense to me. Moving on, like I said, it's a little bit all over the place. I mentioned this before, the orgasm gap. We're having a discussion about how a lot of women, including outside the sex trade, like I completely acknowledge there are a lot of women who are having negative experiences with sex outside the sex trade too. A lot of women who feel, they need to fake an orgasm to get out of a sexual interaction that's not really wanted or not going so well, or otherwise, men will continue to bother them. And that's an issue. And we're talking about that. I'm so glad we're talking about that. That's not how it should be. Women shouldn't have to fake pleasure. But I mean, what is one of the central skills of prostitution is having to fake your desire? Because the addicting thing and the thing where the woman really has to like split herself apart is that the buyer wants her, he pays because when he pays, he feels like he'll know what he'll get. He'll get what he ordered. But at the same time, she's supposed to pretend this is really desired. She's supposed to play, this is actually spontaneous, interesting, authentic, but also do what he says. Somehow, like she's supposed to pretend that the exact thing he does without any course correction is exactly what she wants. And sex players talk about this, like they know that women fake. They know women don't enter the sex trade because they're nymphomaniacs. They know it's fake, but they don't care. And it, again, makes no sense to me that we're talking about women. You need to stop faking your orgasms and demand real pleasure. But in the sex trade, faking orgasms is a job skill and is not concerning, and is not a sign that, men are being reckless with women in the bedroom. Reckless is putting it mildly. What else are we saying? A lot of people are becoming critical of porn, but it sort of often is limited to, what the effect that, porn is creating unrealistic expectations. And that's certainly part of the problem. It's not the only one. The only part, because if we say, porn isn't real, that forgets that the women in the video are real women, unless it's anime porn, I guess. Most of the time, these are real women, and it is really happening to their bodies. But yeah, aside from that, we're telling men and boys like don't reenact porn. That's not authentic female sexuality. That's some pornographer sexuality, and rightly so. I'm glad we're having that discussion, and more people are joining in. But one group of women who has to reenact porn all the time, aside from the fact that a lot of them are also in porn, what women in prostitution do. A lot of women have reported this over the last years. The demands and behaviors of sex buyers have become, in many ways, more brutal. When the girlfriend refuses to reenact XY porn sex act, well, he still has the brothel as an option. He'll always find a woman somewhere in the sex trade who is going to have to do that thing that he's, really seeking to reenact. So if we're demanding, we don't want to have porn sex, we're finding a lot of it degrading, disrespectful, and violent. Well, neither do women in the sex trade. Like, either we demand it for all women or it's not a real demand at all. What else? What is the classic thing that we all talk about? We talk about the Madonna-whore divide. What are walks all about? Like, not all of us necessarily like slut walks. Like me personally, I don't like calling any woman a slut. I don't think we're going to fix misogyny by saying we're all sluts, but we can debate that. But we all agree like we shouldn't shame women for a certain level of sexual activity or lack thereof. That's all bullshit, and we refuse to be put into groups. We're all one group. We're all women. We're not sluts over there and good women over there. When you look at how men view women in the sex trade and outside, they very, very much view us as two separate categories. Women outside the sex trade, they're getting too emancipated and they're annoying and they're making too many requests and, they want to be wined and dined, and they're so exhausting. And well, with women in the sex trade, you can skip all that. You don't have to endear yourself to her. You don't have to bother with any of that. Or the division of, well, the woman at home, with her, I have this, what in Germany we call flowery sex. I have vanilla sex with her, but the woman in the brothel, I have the hardcore stuff. That's where I go for that. So that putting women into categories, I mean, prostitution makes men delineate between groups of women very, very strongly. Even though in practice, of course, we know that the misogyny in brothels often spills out. The attitudes, of course, do end up often extending to women outside, but at least in certain contexts, there's a very strong divide made there, which is, yeah, something we want to abolish. We are trying to recover a lot of misogynistic, not recover, retire a lot of misogynistic language, right? I mean, we talk about how, for example, in the music scene, speaking about women in degrading ways is, unfortunately, it's like still very, very prevalent, but at least we're having the conversation of, to be a cool dude, do you have to call women bitches? No, you don't, right? Like at least we're having the conversation of, is that really necessary? Is that really edgy? Men on John forums have absolutely no qualms calling all kinds of names. Like, sure, they'll say sex worker sometimes, they'll say sex service provider, or just say, lady, professional lady. But a lot of them go for hooker and whore and cunt, or use really, really awful language for women's body parts, including referring to their genitalia as holes. Anyone who's mad about, I don't know, rap songs and who goes on a John forum, they would just implode. So if we think that this kind of language in pop songs or popular music is a problem, well, what about whole forums with thousands of members talking about using women and referring to them with that kind of language? Okay, moving on. Not just on the forums, any man who uses prostitution will sooner or later come across the extreme evaluating and classifying of women based on bodies. So if a woman wants to advertise herself for the sex trade, she's going to have to, well, probably create an online profile and give pretty detailed, intimate information about her body. Well, height, weight, breast size, skin color, ethnicity. There's the whole racism aspect, that racial fetishization aspect that is extreme. Is she pierced? Does she have tattoos? Is she shaven at various parts of her body? And then later, when men have paid for what a lot of people like to call work or service, they will review not so much just her behavior, but her body. They'll give detailed, evaluations of, the firmness of her breasts or the tightness of her vagina. And like, we're all upset about men giving women scores. What's this one? She's a 10, or she's a 5, or she's a 2. We all think that's really degrading, right? Then why is it okay to review a woman's body like an Amazon product? Like, the sex trade takes everyday misogyny and amplifies it 10 times, 50 times, 100 times. I have a quote here in my blog post from a pimp who describes how she went about recruiting women. She said, I honored men's request for different kinds of women. Once, for instance, I found gigantic girls for a client who preferred heavyset women. Just like when you go to a restaurant, you're paying, you can order what you want. So if I want to order a pizza, I can say, I want to have ham on my pizza, or mushrooms, or, I can order different kinds of pizza. In the sex trade, you can order a big woman, a small woman, a white woman, a black woman, an Asian woman, a brunette, a blonde. Every demeaning way that you can break down a woman's body, it happens in the sex trade. And I really want to emphasize the racism aspect. Sometimes I just feel a bit cynical when I see people discussing, let's say, representation in a Netflix TV show. I'm not saying those things don't matter at all, or there's a bit of a racial stereotype in a Netflix show. Okay, sure, we can talk about that. But any racist stereotype that you can think of exists in the sex trade, but like crystallized, purified, right? So Asian women as submissive, and Latinas as nymphos, and Black women as sexually aggressive. Eastern European women, again, as submissive. There's a lot of variations of submissive. Men will also freely use, and prostitution advertisement too will use really, really degrading words. A lot of words that we've decided we don't want to use anymore at all. So in Germany, I don't know if it's the same in English-speaking countries, the term gypsy is very degrading, or many people consider it so. Say we shouldn't use it at all. A lot of women in the German sex trade, or just in the European sex trade overall, do come from the Roma minority, which is what some people refer to as gypsies. These Johns have absolutely no problem using that kind of language. That's extremely normalized. They're not above using the N-word either for Black women. I haven't even gotten into like the explicit sexual violence and the dehumanization that happens in the sex trade is extreme. And like I said, it's not just on these forums, because a lot of people like to say, oh, not all men use those forums. Just look at some of these ads. If a woman is from a certain ethnic background, that's going to be probably a centerpiece of her ad. Or if she's from a less desirable so-called ethnic background, let's say she's Roma, how can she make herself more appealing to what sex buyers want? Or just make more money, actually. Well, a lot of Roma women will pretend to be Spanish or Greek, right? So Southern European, because men value those more. They value less accessible women more. That's why a German woman would, broadly speaking, fetch a higher price than a Roma woman, because German women on average are less desperate, and there's fewer of them in the sex trade. They're like a rarer commodity. Why does any of this get a pass? The only way that I can explain it is that people either don't know or they just refuse to believe that this is happening. Moving on, we're talking more and more about sexual health. And that's great. That's very important, right? We're talking, especially to kids, we're talking about protection, we're talking about STIs, we're trying to destigmatize STIs. It's not so uncommon that a lot of us will sooner or later have maybe one of these, less serious ones, luckily, but they're really dangerous health, especially women's health, because women are, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe women are a bit more vulnerable to STIs due to just biological reasons. This might be no surprise, not just in sex trade. A lot of men don't want to use condoms, right? Sex buyers don't want to use condoms. A lot of them don't. You'd think they would worry about STIs because historically there's an association with women in sex trade and STIs. Like, women have been stigmatized as, transmitting them, as being disease carriers. The person who's not wanting to use Jen is not her, it's the John. He's also the one who goes on and gives it to his wife or his girlfriend. Because a lot of these men are still sexually active. Actually, they're not only are they single, they are also still having sex with their partner. They're just having, different kinds of sex, or they're looking for variation when they go to the brothel. So there's a significant number of men out there for momentary pleasure endanger the lives of everyone involved. And yeah, there are campaigns to encourage condom use, but who can, control what happens between a woman and a John alone in the brothel room? A lot of women, especially, in places with high competition and low prices, they will accept a little extra payment to not use one, not because they're irresponsible, but because they're that desperate. I definitely emphasize that the vast majority of women in the sex trade do use condoms, or at least try to enforce condom use, but they're often fighting the John. They're Johns that just pull off the condom midway, right? What's it called? Stealthing? Or you try to convince her and break down her resistance. This is very common. It's not enough to just install a machine, condom dispensing machine in the brothel. It's about what is the power dynamic in the room. And for a lot of women, it means having to accept condomless, or having men, this is a form of rape, the condom without consent, and very often not having particular recourse for that. And then there are some men, for them it's a thrill, the risk of getting a dangerous STI. They specifically seek out women in street prostitution or women with addiction issues. I wish I was making this up, but these men exist, and they're playing Russian roulette with everyone's lives and getting a kick out of it. So I'm gonna start going more into this area of more explicit violence. In my opinion, what I've talked about so far is already various forms of violence, but the more obvious physical kind would be what I would cover next. And I realized I forgot to read you any quotes from sex buyers. I mean, some of them are really pornographic. It's also not fun well, obviously it's not fun. I don't really like reading them out so much, but just as a small reference here, if any of you do want to look at that, if you want to look at the sources for everything I'm saying, it's all on my blog. I've already touched on this earlier. A lot of men have the idea, like, if I have paid for half an hour or a whole hour, for that hour, that woman is mine, at least to the extent that she should do everything that we, discussed, negotiated at the beginning. And if she doesn't, or she doesn't to my satisfaction, then he has various ways to punish her. And, some men do actually get violent when they get mad because they feel like they just, wasted money. It can be in the form of him giving her a negative review. And on the forums, they call the German term is rip off cunt. They use that term all the time. That's an established term on German John forums, how they refer to women who don't satisfy them in whatever way. And then they tell other men, look, don't go to that one. She doesn't deliver what was promised. She's not enthusiastic enough. She's not whatever. And worst case scenario, he can hurt her business that way. Some of the men make these complaints actually on Google Maps. I'm not even kidding. You don't have to go to the darknet. These are all legal websites, by the way. Some of them do it on Google Maps. So I have seen conversations on Google Maps between Johns complaining, this woman, this stupid rip-off bitch, whatever. And then the brothel owner replies, please tell me which woman this was. Sort of shows you the job of the brothel owner is not to protect the woman. He is interested in, or she, maximizing revenue. And they will take these complaints sometimes and then give the woman hell for it. Best case scenario, that's just a stern conversation. Worst case scenario, because there is a significant amount of organized crime involved in the legal sex trade, there are reports of John saying they saw a pimp taking a woman's room and then they heard screaming because he was either shouting at her or beating her. Johns know this, that often the pimp is not there to protect the woman, he's there to protect his income. Often pimps and Johns, they ally with each other. So now we're already talking about some really heavy stuff. What else? We're discussing, especially in the course of Me Too, how rape is more complicated than a man taking a woman and throwing her on the bed or using a knife or a gun to intimidate her, right? We're starting to discuss that there are many victims who don't, scream, or who don't say no, or who are emotionally intimidated, or like we talked about with the landlord, it can be financially intimidated, but that's still rape. And there are a lot of descriptions from Johns talking about women who are sort of silently acquiescing, or they are showing signs of dissociation, which many victims do because it's a self-protection mechanism, or it's the concern, if I fight back, it's going to get more brutal. So they sort of just clam up, don't say anything. Actually, the New Zealand and Aussie Johns, right? So the things I'm describing, I focus on Germany, but they apply in other places too, like New Zealand and Australia. They call these women starfish because they're just lying there, sort of legs spread and just waiting until it's over. That's not consent. I would say a lot of that is most likely rape. And Johns see this, and they do describe women as dolls or blocks of ice or even corpses. And again, you can find this, you don't have to go far. I found descriptions like this on Google Maps, on Google Map reviews. So these are not isolated cases. Men see this, but their idea is, well, I've paid, so my job's not to endear myself to her or take care of her safety, pleasure, consent, whatever. It doesn't matter. I paid. I'm going to do what I want. I'm not going to say it's completely black and white. It's not like there's never ever been a John who was like, oh, I was really disturbed. She seemed to not like it, so I stopped, or I didn't even touch her in the first place. I mean, that does happen, right? But a lot of men really, really don't care. A lot of men are meeting women who are describing various kinds of physical pain before, during, after the sexual contact, whatever you want to call it. There are men who are describing women with jaw pain, because it does happen that if you have to give a lot of blowjobs, that can strain your jaw, literally. We're like moving away from, at best, that's just a boring sexual interaction. Like, now women are in pain, men are seeing this, and they don't care. The kind of sexual culture that we want to establish, if a man sees a woman in pain, he stops, obviously. He stops, he tries to make her comfortable, he doesn't continue that. But in the sex trade, a lot of men, for them, it's so normalized to see a woman with jaw pain or hand or back or vaginal, obviously, or anal, that they just carry on, or they're even mad at her. They're like, oh, why is she not taking a break? Like, why is she continuing when she's so sore? Well, guess what? Because she has to, because either she has a pimp or poverty is her pimp. I think it's probably common knowledge that a lot of women in the sex trade use drugs or alcohol to cope with the physical stress, the emotional stress, the tiredness. Well, those of you who have seen addiction before, or drug and alcohol use, you can often tell when someone's consumed a legal or illegal drug. And John's described this as well. They see women. I mean, a lot of brothels have bars. One way the brothel makes money is selling alcohol. sometimes the women can make a little bit extra too from that, so they would encourage the Johns to buy drinks. But I mean, what are we doing? We're having this discussion in culture of how if you're high or drunk, you can't consent. We're talking about these, frat parties where young women are given way too much alcohol, or their drinks are laced with something, or, and we're all talking about how, well, you have to be a certain level of sober, or you can't be too off your mind on something, or you can't consent. But when the sex trade is legal, there are no laws that prohibit the use of drunk or high women by Johns. I mean, the woman herself could press charges, but she's already in the throes of addiction. That's not likely going to happen. So there are even women who are showing signs of shooting drugs, and we know that when it's intravenous drug use, that's especially dangerous and probably an addiction that's progressed quite far. There are women in some sectors of prostitution using these kinds of drugs, and Johns see this and they just carry on. And actually, also our authorities in places like Germany see this, and they're just like, yeah, c'est la vie. That's how it is. It's sad, sure. It's not glamorous, but what can you do? Yeah, even the authorities' blasé attitude about this, that's really upsetting. And like I said, completely disconnected to the conversations that we're having about places like frat parties or, yeah, wherever else people are drinking or taking drugs. Moving on, one of, I think, most important things to understand about prostitution is that this like sex work over here, trafficking over there division doesn't work in practice. And you can see this from the reports of the Johns. So they are going to a legal brothel, a legal street area, or getting a woman from a legal escort agency. But they are seeing various signs of trafficking. And some Johns do learn to spot this. Some women get tattoos from the gang or the pimp that they're owned by. So this wouldn't be any tattoo. I'm not an expert on this. I can't describe exactly how you would tell that it's that kind of tattoo. Johns do talk about this on their forums. They discuss the kind of tattoos they see on women, and especially the ones that they see repeated on several women in the same area and those kinds of things. That's one sign they see. And I've mentioned this before. Sometimes the John is literally like just walking past or like standing across from the pimp, and he knows it's a pimp. He's not just a bookie, just doing a little bit of bookkeeping. That is a man who is emotionally, financially, physically intimidating and then abusing that woman. And it can go so far as there's a breaking in, like when that's how you refer to, I think with race horses or with circus animals, they do this. Yeah, a certain level of threatening or hurting the animal until it does a circus trick or whatever. And they use this same word to refer to when a trafficker or a pimp attempts to break the spirit of a woman in the sex trade. And the breaking is done through, well, serial rape. And there are Johns who know about this practice, and there are Johns who knowingly participate in practice. They talk about this on their forums. This woman has just arrived from Poland. We are breaking her in. She's still learning the ropes. She still like says no and moves away and cries and stuff, but she's learning. She's getting better at it. She's progressively being able to take more. This is also a point where I think it's important to point out, yeah, not every John is this like massive sadist who's in cahoots with pimps. It's not that simple. I would say that's probably a minority who would go that far. But why does she need, in quotation marks, obviously breaking in? Why? For the kind of John that isn't a sadist, but still desires compliance. Why does she have to be compliant? Why do they want a woman who has learned that her no doesn't matter, so she doesn't even try, so that she's available to that larger market about the Johns who don't really want to look so close, who don't really want to care, who don't really want to investigate, who don't really want to bother thinking about what they're doing. Prostitution Survivor Hushkamal always says this: when a John walks into a brothel or wherever else, he cannot tell the story of that woman. He won't know for sure what's going on with her. There could be, like I said, there could be signs of force, of poverty, of distress, but there may not be, because like we've talked about, she's taught to either, be compliant and quiet or fake enthusiasm, and he can never know what's genuine. He's intentionally, or well, he's putting himself in a position where he can never know. He can never know if he just paid to rape someone. So the question we might ask ourselves is, but what if we apply the exact same rules to prostitution as we do to any other sexual situation? What if the woman can say no to any man, any act, at any time, and her pleasure matters just as much as his? This scenario is not possible in practice, as the very appeal of prostitution to men who pay is to violate the rules of consent. So to get a woman who would never look at him twice outside the industry to get sex acts that other women have refused, to get sex at any time on the push of a button, when a real world partner might turn him down anytime. So men pay because they want control and they want little to no chance of rejection. And if you take this away and say that the sex buyer must, charm the woman with equal effort he'd have to put into a date or even just a one night stand, then the sex trade no longer carries any appeal because that's exactly what he's paid to not have to do. And this is not to suggest that there is no abuse in the dating world, casual or committed. Obviously, there is tons, and we're all talking about that all the time. But prostitution constitutes an institutionalized violation of every aspect of meaningful consent. Sex built on mutual respect, mutual attraction, and pleasure is its own reward, and it has no monetary value. It can't be commodified. This is the core conversation that we need to have. What kind of society do we want to live in? How do we want to relate to each other? Men and women, locals and migrants, people of different ethnic backgrounds. The sex trade is like the worst version of ourselves, or well, the worst version of men. It's not the kind of society I want to live in. In investigating this, looking at this has made it just impossible for me to call prostitution work and to advocate that, if we just were reduce police presence, that's it, that's fine. The rest will sort of sort itself out. And then it really will, two consenting adults on eye level. That's a pipe dream.